60 plus years after the Second World War has ended, we know quite a bit more about what was going on than the people who were actually living through the experience. Now, with all of the memoirs that have come out, all of the analysis, the information, the data that's available from all the participants, you can see that the catastrophic German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942, early 1943, was probably the turning point in the war. Turning points themselves are a little cliche to simply say that. If you could, put your finger on the moment the war turned from one sort of momentum to another. But probably not too far of a stretch to call Stalingrad the turning point. The point at which the Germans could no longer realistically see themselves winning the war. Now, they didn't have to assume that they were going to lose it. Some sort of stalemate, negotiated peace, armistice could leave them in control of tons of Europe. No one knew how that was going to turn out. But the chances of the Germans actually conquering the Soviet Union, going and turning around and beating the British and dealing with the Americans, all of that stuff became much more the stuff of fantasy after Stalingrad had ended. Now, the people at the time probably didn't realize how big of a deal the loss at Stalingrad was. Turning points in wars are something that's usually determined after the war. There are German generals who probably realized it was the turning point. There are memoirs by German veterans on the ground, the average soldiers, who certainly saw it as a turning point. But after Stalingrad ended, the German high command began doing exactly what they would have expected to do, the year before. They started to come up with the plan for 1943. 1941, the plan was to drive to Moscow and take it. 1942, the plan was to drive to the oil fields of the Caucasus and take it. Both of those offensives had been launched in the summer. The late spring, early summer. So, once again, the campaigning season would start after the mud dried, late spring, early summer, and the German high command was planning for an offensive. Now, I want to re-emphasize that just because the Germans were planning or talking about planning a new offensive, that doesn't mean that the violence had ever died down along the Eastern Front. The fighting along the 2,000-mile, stretch of territory from Finland to the Black Sea was constant. There was fighting over local landmarks, in a no-man's land between German trenches and Soviet trenches. There were localized and smaller offensives and counterstrokes. The fighting was going on all the time. These major war-winning or war-losing offensives were a simple spike in the normal level of violence going on. Leningrad in the north was still encircled as it had been by the Germans since 1941, the people there still starving to death and suffering. Eastern Europe was still in German hands, occupied by the Nazis, suffering under their cruel regime and harsh measures. These offensives that we're talking about here were the grand designs for victory. In 1941, it had been Barbarossa, the drive to Moscow. In 1942, it had been the Operation Blue drive to the Caucasus. In 1943, it was going to be something called Operation Citadel. Operation Citadel was a plan that the German generals came up with. Adolf Hitler was to some degree out of the loop. He had pulled himself back from his enthusiastic and aggressive ideas on how to win this war because his ideas had led to catastrophe up to this point. He had put a lot of emphasis into the new designs, new tank designs, new equipment, new aircraft that were coming off the assembly lines, but he didn't have any plan for how to use this new equipment in a way that would bring him victory. As author Alan Clark writes, quote, "He seemed to have no ideas," end quote. So he left it up to his generals. Well, the German generals were split on this idea. Once Hitler said, "It's up to you guys," they had a bunch of different opinions. Heinz Guderian, the gifted panzer leader, said, "Don't do anything. Go on the defensive in 1943. Let the Russians crash against a defensive wall of German troops. Let us rebuild our forces, get all the new tanks together, get good numbers, good trained troops, and in 1944 launch a war-changing offensive." Many of the other German generals disagreed. They thought for reasons of morale and the question of momentum, you had to just do something. You couldn't just sit there. German offensive strategy was always geared toward launching attacks as opposed to, taking them. Von Manstein had some different ideas about the way this stroke or counterstroke should be handled, but most of the German generals settled upon a bulge in the eastern front line, a salient, a place where the Soviets had pushed ahead of the rest of the forces, so it created a sort of a bag jutting out toward the German side of the line. This is a classic place for an offense to happen, because it's really easy to get military units on both sides of the bulge, right at the neck of it, and pinch it shut, and then trapping any of the enemy's units that might happen to be in that bag. So the German generals began looking at this salient around a city named Kursk. This was going to be a huge offensive. It was going to take the mass of what Germany had available for its cutting edge, force it into one force, and launch it all at once. More tanks than they had ever used, more powerful equipment than they'd ever employed. They were going to take the army of 1943 and launch it into action in an all-out, attempt to gain the initiative back in the war and inflict a crushing defeat on the Soviet Union. Now, Hitler was nervous about this. The great gambler who had gotten Germany this far had kind of lost his nerve a bit because he was almost out of chips. He didn't have armies that he could afford to lose anymore on gambles. He's like a man at the wagering table that doesn't have a lot of chips left, but he needs a big score, but he's afraid to push that whole pile in because if he loses that, he's left with nothing. He's a fish, left out to dry. Hitler told Guderian that the thought of this operation to pinch off the salient at Kursk, what was being called Operation Citadel, he said to Guderian, quote, "It makes my stomach turn over," end quote. He was nervous about this whole thing. He had reason to be. You see, the idea of pinching off salients is such a basic part of offensive, war strategy that everyone knows that that's the most likely place an offensive is going to come from. In 1941, the Soviets picked incorrectly where the Germans would attack. Thought they'd attack down in the south by Kiev, put their forces down there to receive the attack. The Germans go into the center of the country, launch right for the capital of Moscow. In 1942, the Soviets think, okay, probably going toward Moscow, going to finish the job they started in 1941. So they put all their crack units up by Moscow. The Germans attack in the south down by Kiev. In 1943, the Soviet leadership looks at the salient at Kursk and says, well, that would be the obvious place to attack, which is exactly what the Germans were thinking, which is probably why they should have gone with Guderian's suggestion or von Manstein's suggestion and done something else altogether. Don't attack where they know you're going to attack. The Germans even found out that the Soviets knew that they were coming at a certain point in the planning process and went forward with it anyway. Bought into Hitler's idea that, so what if they know we're coming? We have these great new tanks, all this great new equipment. We're the Germans. We do the blitzkrieg. We'll knock them dead. We've never failed to do that in the past. Certainly never failed to have the blitzkrieg work. People like Guderian weren't buying it. The troops on the ground weren't buying it either. In early May, Hitler decides to postpone this huge, change in fortune battle for the German army. The Tiger tanks and the new Panther tanks that he wants so badly aren't arriving as quickly as he'd expected, so he's going to delay the offensive a couple more months. Many German generals get real nervous about this because they know the Soviets are already fortifying the area. They see the offensive coming. This will just give them more time to turn it into a fortress on the ground. The newly revised date for the start of what's being called the Kursk offensive is to be July 4th. As the chief of staff of the 48th Panzer Division observed, quote, "Independence Day for America, the beginning of the end for Germany," end quote. Hitler delivers a pre-battle message on July 1st, 1943, telling the German soldiers that this battle is the one that will teach, other peoples what happens when you stand against German armed might. It was one of those kind of things. And the soldiers on the ground could see that the might of Germany was assembled. It was one of the largest forces Germany ever put in the field, about to be part of the largest armored conflict of all time. Kursk is one of those battles war gamers still obsess about, because there was so much stuff there. The Germans have deployed 37 divisions, more than 900,000 men, including more than 2,500 tanks and assault guns, more than 10,000 guns. They've brought 1,800 aircraft to the party as well. Now, against this, just to prove they're not slouching at all, the Red Army has 1,300,000 troops, all of them in deeply fortified positions, rank upon rank upon rank, protected by 8,000 landmines per square mile, more than 3,000 tanks, 20,000 guns, 2,500 aircraft, and the Red Army had dug more than 3,000 miles of trenches to cover the fighting zone. Now, the first thing you'll notice if you look at this battle is that the Germans, the attackers, are outnumbered by the Red Army. This is a major violation of all the standard rules of war. The attacker's supposed to have at least a 3-to-1 superiority over the defender. The defense has more innate power than the offense. You do better if you're even better than 3-to-1. 5-to-1's even, more optimal. The Germans are outnumbered. Once again, the German high command looking at these wonderful new tanks and thinking these tanks will make up for the fact that we're violating the basic rules, the 3-to-1. The Wehrmacht's professional generals and veterans warned them. But the true believers bought into the idea that, when you added up everything the Germans brought to the table, once again they were going to show their superiority over the Red Army. Now, the Soviets are so aware of when this battle's going to kick off that a half hour before it does, the Soviets launch a pre-battle bombardment against the German staging areas, where the tanks are all lining up, where the infantry are getting ready on the road to push forward before the first light. Right before they do that, the Soviet artillery begins to fall. Marshal Zhukov, the head of the Red Army, who was there, called the sound of this preemptive artillery barrage, quote, a symphony from hell, unquote. So it's an inauspicious beginning right there. Shows all the Germans whose morale might have been a little shaky, or even those whose morale was rock solid, that we know you're coming. We're ready for you. Taste this. This time. One side got taught a lesson at Kursk, but it was the German side. The Germans, who had been teaching modern warfare throughout this whole war, finally saw their blitzkrieg run up against a counter tactic. To counter this lightning war idea of punching through the enemy lines and sending your armor into the back to disrupt the fragile communications and support areas, you run into the Russians' defense in depth. It's almost like a counter move in chess. You take these soldiers and you pile them rank upon rank upon rank upon rank, and you put these gun positions around them, and you put the mines out, and the anti-tank guns, and the aircraft, and basically you suck up everything the Germans can deliver and don't give them an area to punch into. The farther in they punch, the more stuff they run into. The Battle of Kursk itself was a number of smaller battles that took place over about a 9-10 day period. More tanks and armored equipment met head-to-head in this battle than at any other time in history. And most veterans of the fighting there seem to remember it being hot, and it may have been warm, but by the actual standards of the Soviet Union at that time of year, it was kind of cool at the time the battle was fought. What these people were probably remembering is the heat generated by the battle. As one Soviet female soldier recalled, quote, the sky thunders, the earth thunders, and you think your heart will explode, and that the skin on your back is about to burst. I hadn't thought that the earth could crack. Everything cracked. Everything roared. The whole world seemed to be swaying. End quote. German tank driver Helmut Steiner's commander told him what had happened at Kursk a month before Steiner missed the battle. His commander said, quote, we started a massive offensive against the Soviets in the Kursk area about a month ago. It was unbelievable. Tanks were fighting tanks in their hundreds. At the same time, Ivan was fully prepared for us. He was dug in at such depth that when we overran one anti-tank position at great cost to our panzers, another would be waiting for us, and another, and another. We were knocking out the Ruskies hand over fist, but he was bashing hell out of us too. Our losses were appalling. Their defense system was over 100 miles wide across the neck of the salient. There were hundreds of groups of 5.76mm anti-tank guns in mutually supporting batteries, backed up by infantry with mortars. Then their engineers had laid thousands of mines to each mile. They had been placed in such a way that to avoid them, we were forced to move toward their guns. After a week or so, we had no choice but to pull back, otherwise we would have been wiped out. Meanwhile, Ivan remained in his thousands. That's the way it always is. At best, all we do is dent the opposition. We always finish up worse than when we started. A lot less tanks and a lot less territory. Ever since Stalingrad, the story has been the same. End quote. Well, Helmut Steiner's tank commander does a pretty good job of explaining how it went. On the 9th of July, 5 days after the battle starts, the Russians say that the German attack has been held and claim that 2,000 tanks were destroyed in the first 4 days. That gives you an idea of the ferocity of this conflict. Go try to find some movies documenting this event. There are precious few. It didn't look like there was a lot of time to sit down and shoot any film of this thing. Or maybe if you had been able to, all you would have seen is smoke. It's that kind of battle. It almost adds to the allure because you wish you could see it. And there was really too much going on at the time for posterity. We may not be able to see what that battle was like now, but the people at the time could smell what it was like then. Some participants of the battle say that you could smell the unburied bodies, the thousands of them, floating in the sun miles away from the fighting area. It was that kind of war. As a German veteran said, quote, "War in the West was proper sport, while war in the East was unmitigated horror." On the 13th of July, despite the maximum efforts by the German forces to break through in the areas where they were supposed to break through, they can't, and Hitler called the offensive off. The battle is a huge win for the Red Army. They've stopped this big German gamble where they threw in all of their best forces once again at a time where they had no reserves. The Germans would never again when Operation Citadel fails, many German generals, and some in the German leadership even, see that the war is lost. A couple of authors even claim that Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, is one of those people who determined at this time that the chances of winning the war had ended with their hopes in the Kursk salient. And if Kursk wasn't enough to make the Germans feel bad about their situation, while Kursk is going on, Sicily is invaded by the Western Allies. It's a little like when Stalingrad happens, the Battle of El Alamein occurs in North Africa, another Allied win. These 1-2 punches seem to come with regularity. Every time the Germans take a big one, they take another one to go with it. After Kursk, the Germans begin a process of a long retreat, a fighting retreat that sometimes is intentional and other times they're trying to hold the line, they just get pushed back. That happens all the way back towards Berlin for the rest of the war. During this long-term maneuver, they adopt a scorched earth policy in the areas where they are vacating. A policy that is frightful to the extreme. It results in many of the worst atrocities committed in the war. After Kursk, the German chief of staff writes his wife, and he tells her, quote, "All hell is loose on the Eastern Front." End quote. Well, to anyone who's been listening to this series of shows up till now, you're wondering how bad things must be now if this general only thinks hell's being unleashed now. What do you call what's happened up till now? Well, when you read them, the stories speak for themselves. The tales of atrocities that were part of this scorched earth policy that we're talking about here is something that reminds you of the stuff of legends. You know, tales of Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun rampaging through civilized areas. Stories of civilians crowded into buildings which are then set on fire. Women and children literally lined up against the wall and machine-gunned. Terrible things. A war of true hatred on all sides with no mercy shown to anyone. And yet, even amidst all this hatred and this lack of mercy and caring and the dehumanization of both sides, the human element still comes into play from time to time. Writer Boris Gorbachevsky tells a wonderful story about a man in his unit with a haunting, moving, wonderful singing voice. He would keep the unit entertained, and Gorbachevsky says, sing loudly and brilliantly in the trenches. The Russians took special care of this man, saw to it that his throat was kept warm, and that he always had a cup of hot tea for him to drink, keep his voice fresh. They would all write home and tell their family how lucky they felt to have such a talent, with them in the unit. One night, that singer was ill, and he couldn't perform. And the Russians received a worried message on the radio from the Germans facing them across no man's land. They said, quote, "What have you done with your singer?" End quote. Even the Germans would stop shooting when the sky performed. One night, the Germans even crept into the no man's land between the two trenches, Gorbachevsky says, braving the danger of being killed, simply to throw a new harmonica into the trenches of the Russians so that the singer would have music to accompany him. Amid the horror, still a little basic humanity could occasionally rise to the surface. And that sort of thing makes you wonder whether those people, those Germans on the one side of the battle line that wanted to hear the Russian singer as much as the Russian singers on the other side of the battle line wanted to hear him, would they even be fighting if it weren't for these governments of theirs? Especially the German government that launched the war. German soldier Günter Koschorek wrote after the war, quote, "When will people realize that it is possible for any of us to be manipulated by domineering and power-crazed individuals who know how to motivate the masses in order to misuse them for their own ends? While they keep well out of the way in safety, they have no hesitation in brutally sacrificing their people in the name of patriotism. Will mankind ever stand together against them? Or are those who died in the fighting dead forever? And will the reasons they gave their lives be forgotten?" End quote. How capable do you think your neighbor or your countrymen are of committing evil acts, if those acts were condoned or encouraged by the government. How about this? What if the government punished you if you didn't commit those evil acts? Makes you start to look at your neighbors, your countrymen, maybe even yourself in a new light. And to say that the political system in Germany and in the Soviet Union wasn't evil, I think is to ignore one of the basic qualities that government looked for when it picked people to serve in it. You know, why was Korczak and all of his comrades, and why were the Russians on the other side of the trenches from him fighting? Well, how about the quality of the leadership that sent them to fight? I've always wondered about, say, look at the Nazis, for example. To me, they look like the Mafia. A lot of those guys in the Nazi hierarchy, in positions of running a major world power, wouldn't have had a job in a democracy. They have a qualification, a character trait, that is highly valuable in the system they operate in. But it's an actual disadvantage in most countries. They're evil. And evil is something that helps you get a promotion in some of these systems. Both in Hitler's and Stalin's regimes, the ability to be bloodthirsty and pitiless are check marks, the good stuff on the resume. The Germans actually picked their mayors for their occupied territories, the Gauleiters. One of the main things they looked for was this. You push good humanitarian people who want to do the best for their country out of positions of power because the evil people are scoring higher on the evil test. Eventually you end up with a government full of these evil people, and then you wonder why it does evil things. At least, Dr. Korczak. How well would Heinrich Himmler or Lavrenti Beria do in democracy? Well, they were in the upper stratus of power in their respective governments in the Second World War. Now, on July 25th, Benito Mussolini is deposed in a coup in Italy. Between August and December 1943, there are 5 attempts on Hitler's life. So now the tide is really turning. The defeats that the Germans and the Axis have suffered look bad enough so it looks like the war is lost to some people, and they're willing to risk their own lives, in the case of going after Adolf Hitler, the lives of their families, to take a shot at the leader. Once again, you wonder what the more rational, more common sense leadership, by comparison, of the Germany of 1914-1918 thought of all this. Now, on the Eastern Front, for the rest of the war, the fighting follows a particular pattern. The pattern is that the Soviets build up for offensives, get their supplies all together, build up the numbers of their troops, they launch the offensive, usually encircling lots of Germans and doing real well, and then they go until they run out of steam, or the German defense stiffens, or they have to slow down because they don't have any supplies, and then they start at that spot to rebuild again. Sort of a series of jumps all the way back to Berlin. Each of these jumps costs the German army a ton of lives. There are still more than 2 million men fighting on the Eastern Front on the German side, which sounds like a lot, until you realize that German casualties for the year 1943 alone, on the Eastern Front alone, topped the 900,000 men. Some good news for the Russians happens. On January 27th, 1944, the people of the city of Leningrad finally have their agony come to an end. The people who have been under siege and for the most part surrounded by the German army since the main attack in 1941 finally have their country liberated. Now, for a while, sometimes when the lake behind the city of Leningrad was frozen up, they could get some supplies into the city, but by and large, think of any major city you want to think of. Now, imagine it cut off from the outside world for more than 2 years. No food, no supplies, nothing. What would that city look like after 2.5 years? Well, Leningrad looked like a city of starving people. In the 2+ years of the siege, almost 1 million people in the city had died from starvation, and cannibalism was widely reported. Historian Max Hastings had an interesting line about this. He said, referring to what would have happened in Great Britain had they ever been taken over by the Nazis, he said, quote, "Even if Britain had been invaded, the inhabitants of its cities would have chosen surrender rather than eat each other." End quote. That's pretty profound when you think about it. Winston Churchill was coming up with a slogan he admits was, "You can always take one with you," meaning, if you're going to die when the Germans invade, take one with you and you kill a lot of Germans. But not a lot of people thought that that's how London was going to maybe be defended. Hastings is right. That is what happened in Leningrad. They ate each other rather than surrender. Now, they really didn't have much of an option. Stalin was basically decreeing that was what was going to happen. Nevertheless, those are the people that lived it, and you just have to shake your head and go, amazing. Imagine the psychic damage living through something like that gives you. In February 1944, Hitler is lecturing all his Eastern Front commanders on National Socialism, believing that these military men just needed to get more into the political spirit to have the right sort of temperament to take on the Russians the way Hitler thinks they need to be taken on. While all this is going on, the Soviets managed to cut off some 60,000 German soldiers in a place known as the Korsun Pocket. It's 100 miles southeast of the city of Kiev, where it's now Ukraine. We wouldn't know a ton about what went on there, except there was a witness who wrote about it. It's a tale that must have been repeated time and time again on the great expanses of the Eastern Front, and few people either thought it worth writing about or could even find the words to explain what happened. Here's a first-hand account of the Korsun Pocket. A Major Kampov of the Red Army wrote the description of the Germans breaking out and being encircled by the Soviets. He said that the Germans formed up into a couple of groups. Quote, so that morning they formed themselves into two marching columns of about 14,000 each, and they marched in this way to Lysyanka, where the two ravines met. Lysyanka was beyond our front line, inside the corridor. The German divisions on the other side were trying to batter their way eastward, but now the corridor was so wide that they hadn't much chance. They were a strange sight, these two German columns that tried to break out of the encirclement. Each of them was like an enormous mob. The spearhead and the flanks were formed by the SS men of the Wallonia Brigade and the Viking Division in their pearl gray uniforms. They were in a relatively good state of physique. Then inside the triangle marched the rabble of the ordinary German infantry, very much more down at the heel. Right in the middle of this, a small select nucleus was formed by the officers. They also looked relatively well fed. So they moved westward along two parallel ravines. They'd started out soon after 4 a.m. while it was still completely dark. We knew the direction from which they were coming. We had prepared 5 lines, 2 lines of infantry, then a line of artillery, and then 2 more lines with the tanks and the cavalry in the way. We let them pass through the first 3 lines without firing a shot. The Germans, believing that they had dodged us and had now broken through our defenses, burst into frantic, jubilant screaming, firing their pistols and Tommy guns into the air as they marched on. They had now emerged from the ravines and reached open country. Then it happened. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Our tanks and our cavalry suddenly appeared and rushed straight into the thick of the 2 columns. What happened then is hard to describe. The Germans ran in all directions, and for the next 4 hours, our tanks raced up and down the plain, crushing them by the hundred. Our cavalry, competing with the tanks, chased them through the ravines where it was hard for tanks to pursue them. Most of the time, the tanks were not using their guns, lest they hit our own cavalry. Hundreds and hundreds of cavalry were hacking at them with their sabers and massacring the Fritzes as no one had ever been massacred by cavalry before. There was no time to take prisoners. It was a kind of carnage that nothing could stop until it was all over. In a small area, over 20,000 Germans were killed. I had been at Stalingrad, but never had I seen such concentrated slaughters in the ravines and fields of that small bit of country. By 9 a.m., it was all over. End quote. You can imagine that scene taking place during the Napoleonic Wars, too, time and time again as Napoleon retreated from vast expanses of Russia, with the Russians on his heels the whole way. Historian Richard Overy said that, quote, Stalin was said to be delighted by the massacre, end quote, at the Korsun Pocket. Delighted. Many German soldiers now knew the fate they faced. Soldier Guy Zayer wrote that he and his cohorts, quote, all knew we were dead men, with no hope of getting through this experience alive, end quote. He said that when fighting, they often did so, quote, in a rage that was akin to taking revenge in advance for our own deaths, end quote. Günter Korczak said that no one was fighting for the Nazi New World Order or any other such idea by this point. Quote, after you've spent some time at the front like I have, you no longer fight for Führer, folk, and fatherland. These ideals have long gone, and no one talks about National Socialism or similar political matters. From all our conversations, it's quite obvious that the primary reason we fight is to stay alive and help our frontline comrades do the same. End quote. That job was made harder for Günter Korczak and his comrades on June 6, 1944, when the Allies finally opened up their second front that Joseph Stalin's been hammering them for years, with the D-Day landings at Normandy. Now, really, it was the third front, and you realize that the Allies are fighting in Italy at this point, too. So there's fighting in the south in Italy, there's fighting now in the west in Normandy, and, of course, the Soviets never stopped fighting. Right after the D-Day landings, supposedly in support for the D-Day landings, people disagree about this, the Soviets launch one of their biggest operations of the war. They're the ones who launched the big spring-summer offensive in 1944, and they name it after one of their generals who fought in the war. It's called Operation Liberation. It was launched on June 22nd, 1944. Coincidentally, but probably not really, the third anniversary of the original 1941 Barbarossa attack against the Soviet Union. In the first 12 days of Bagration, the Soviet Union looks like they're trying to match the German efforts in 1941. Army Group Center on the German side, all by itself, loses 25 divisions and well over 300,000 men. In the ensuing weeks, it'll lose more than 100,000 more. During the entire 2 months surrounding Operation Bagration, the Germans lose a staggering 550,000 men killed or captured. And the Soviets lose 200,000, so it's still a costly victory. The Soviets can afford it, though. By late fall 1944, they have about 6.5 million men on the Eastern Front, facing about 2.2 million Germans, and that includes their Axis allies as well. You can feel the momentum start to favor the Soviets in a big way. I mean, after all, they launched Bagration at the same time that they were fighting on other parts of the front with 124 divisions, 1,200,000 men, more than 5,000 tanks, 30,000 guns, 6,000 aircraft. The Soviets seemed to do everything on a titanic scale. The Germans could field a measly 63 divisions, 900 tanks, 10,000 guns. You could see how all the efforts to compete on all the fronts were hurting the Germans, in addition to all the losses they'd suffered so far. One history website put it like this, quote, "Geographically, it dwarfed the campaign for Normandy. In 4 weeks, it inflicted greater losses on the German army than the Wehrmacht had suffered in the 5 months at Stalingrad. With more than 2.3 million men, 6 times the artillery, twice the number of tanks that launched the Battle of the Bulge, it was the largest Allied operation of World War II. It demolished 3 Axis armies, tore open the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, the Red Army's spring 1944 blitzkrieg, was designed to support the Allied operations in France, liberate Russian territory, and break the back of the Wehrmacht once and for all." End quote. It pretty much did all of that. It showed how well the Soviets had learned the blitzkrieg tactics from the Germans, and they handled it so well that the Germans were shocked by the Red Army's performance. They shouldn't have been. They knew how well the Soviet leaders were commanding these troops. This is another one of the little aspects of the war on the Eastern Front as far as we Western allies are concerned. We don't give the Soviet generals and field marshals their due. Historian Max Hastings says straight up that Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet Union was the best Allied general of the war, bar none. This will come as a shock to those of us who were raised under the idea that Patton, or Montgomery, or Eisenhower, or MacArthur was the best. Truthfully, any of those generals would probably fall somewhere in the middle of the upper pack of the Soviet Union, who could also boast Rokossovsky and Konev and Chuikov and a whole handful of other really, really top-line leaders and a lot of competent people in that. They were used to commanding huge armies and fighting massive battles of the kind that they very, very rarely, if ever, saw on the Western Front. Heinz Guderian of the German High Command says the Soviets were, quote, brilliantly led. Max Hastings also stresses the courage of the Red Army soldiers, saying that, quote, the Red Army often displayed courage and determination far above anything that could have been asked of American and British troops. And he was right about that. The Americans and the British fought well, but both of them were very concerned, as you might expect, with casualties. This was something that didn't trouble the Russians as much. Military historians who are unbiased will point out often that the Germans and the Soviets fielded the 2 most effective and dangerous ground forces in the Second World War. And it's a long way to the 1940s. And the Red Army of 1944 is a completely different animal than the one of 1941, 1942, just as the German army is a completely different animal from then as well. The Germans have gotten worse. The Soviets have turned themselves into a gargantuan powerhouse. Equipment, tactics, leadership. They had become one of the great land armies of the 20th century. The amount of equipment that they produced just in the final year of the war shows the transformation. They produced 30,000 tanks, 40,000 planes in the last year of the war. Gone, long gone were the days of having to share a single rifle between 2 or 3 Soviet soldiers. It's also completely underappreciated in the West how big and important these military campaigns in the East are. I have a ton of Western books on the Second World War, some of them going back to almost right after the war. They are almost to a book, huge and thick and comprehensive. Yet you'd be surprised how few of them have much on the Soviet or Eastern side of the conflict at all in them. Many go from Barbarossa to Stalingrad and right to Berlin, as though nothing else happened. Some even leave out Stalingrad. The crucial battles of 1944 and early 1945, not mentioned in almost any of them, a very small amount. I have one from Life magazine, the photo magazine in 1960. When they get to the stuff on the Eastern Front, they have no photos, so they just use paintings. A whole book of photos, every bit of the Eastern Front stuff, what little they gave you. That is amazing, inexcusable, and revealing. Operation Bagration, in addition to killing a lot of Axis soldiers, netted a lot of prisoners for the Soviets. The Soviets decided, in a move that reminds you a lot of the ancient Roman practice of the triumph, where they would march the defeated leaders of some of the army through the Roman streets so the citizens could get a look at them. In Moscow, the government of Joseph Stalin marches the Germans captured at Bagration through the Moscow streets. You can see newsreel footage of this now. It's a hell of a sight. You want to talk about most of the enemy looking terribly beaten and stunned to be walking down Moscow streets, and their own streets at home, if they live in the big cities, have buildings that have been demolished by bombing everywhere, and the streets in Moscow are pristine as they come to this crowd that stares at them in what people who were there say was absolute silence. They were watching these monsters of their nightmares, these people that had inflicted all these hardships on them, and it was almost like they were struck dumb as to what do you say at moments like this. One old Russian woman was heard to mutter, quote, "Just like our poor brothers, driven into the war," end quote. So there was a sympathy for these soldiers who looked pitiable. But then Alexander Worth wrote about seeing said that amid the silence, quote, "I heard a little girl perched on her mother's shoulder say, 'Mummy, are those the people who killed Daddy?' He says the mother hugged the child and wept. A reminder of what was going on, how deeply all those people marching past had affected people watching them march past. Traumatized people. Scenes like the parading German prisoners through the streets of Moscow were having a devastating effect on the morale of Germany's higher military leaders. And who could blame them? After all, the summer of 1944 is a disaster for the German army, worse in its totality than Stalingrad. Between July and September 1944, Wehrmacht losses topped 215,000 men killed. They topped 620,000 men missing or captured in the east. 106 divisions shattered in a few months. Total German losses on the Eastern Front by the summer of 1944 are more than 2 million men dead, wounded, captured, or missing. This leads to yet another attempt on Hitler's life on July 20, 1944. The most successful one to date, by the way. It's known as the July 20th plot. This is the famous one, where Count Klaus von Stauffenberg smuggles a bomb in a briefcase into Hitler's conference room. The resulting explosion killed several of Hitler's confidants. But a heavy wooden table saved the Fuhrer's life. Many, many Germans would pay the price for that failed assassination attempt. On August 1st, 1944, another tragedy takes place. The Poles in the city of Warsaw, seeing the Red Army simply, across the Vistula River, right on the other side of the city, decide to stage an uprising, a long-planned, long-awaited uprising, and throw the German occupiers out of the city. Now, it's a complex affair designed to have one Polish faction gain the lead on a pro-communist Polish faction. The uprising comes a year and 4 months after the uprising in the Jewish ghetto area of Warsaw. That revolt led to the SS killing 20,000 Jewish men, women, and children, and then sending the 50,000 captured survivors to the death camps. In this latest uprising, led by a Pole named Bor Komorowski,